video to continue with our evaluation of education policies and to give you a little bit more information that you can use in your essays to really show balance when you are developing the use of and then criticising these education policies. So we're going to start off by having a look at this particular graph here, which shows the achievement gap between free school meals students, which is the blue line, and non-free school meals students, which is this kind of dark red line here. And what we're seeing is that the gap has remained reasonably steady. And this is achievement. So we're seeing that achievement has kind of been quite steadily climbing. We don't know whether that's a dip down yet or not. It could just be a blip. But we are seeing that that gap is very much still there. So what we can deduce from that, going from 2004, and then we've got 2010, where we hit those coalition policies and all of the academisation being really rolled out, en masse. And we can see that this gap has still remained. So, and it's still a significant gap. So we can criticise the policies for not having done anything to remedy that. And what we've got here is some information, the attainment gap, and this is from the DFE. So the graph and the information is from the DFE, so it's a reliable source. The attainment gap between children eligible and not eligible for free school meals is apparent at the age of 7. So we can tell the difference in 7-year-olds, but basically from the background they're from. So we've got 62% versus 80% reaching the expected level in national tests. So this is obviously at primary level. And at the age of 11, we've got 75% versus 89%. So we can still see this gap of people reaching the expected level for students. It's not just achievement that is affected, it's also rates of progress according to the DFE. So pupils who are entitled to free school meals have a lower rate of progress at school. That tells us again that there is something kind of holding them back, or some inequalities in the education system. And we've also got then figure 1 here, the achievement gap between pupils eligible for free school meals and non-free school meals in terms of GCSE results, including English and Maths. So that newer measure where GCSE, those 5 A's to C's, has to include English and Maths. And we can see that that gap is still prominent. So that's what you want to bring into your writing. This gap is prominent. Therefore, we can question how effective these academisation and other coalition policies have been. So we can evaluate this by also questioning whether schools should be able to fix every problem in society. So Ofsted have actually been the ones to point this out. So we can use this as a really useful argument to bring in another view. So basically, Ofsted pointed out that there are factors beyond the school gates and communities where pupils live. These factors can have a detrimental impact on their achievement. So schools can do much to improve the outcomes of disadvantaged pupils, but only so much. So when we do look at these big gaps between children from deprived backgrounds and people from more privileged backgrounds, we can then also flip that round and say, but actually, should we be expecting schools to be able to fix society as a whole? Now, if you look at the Finnish model that we've looked at and some of the sort of literature about why Finland went for their very egalitarian education system, one of the reasons was because they did feel that school was the root of societal inequality. However, Ofsted are saying, schools can only do so much, and these are problems that are not of schools' making, and they cannot solve these problems by themselves. So this doesn't matter whether you agree with this or not, but this is a very useful point to be able to bring in to add an extra layer to the balance that you're showing in your essays. So they're pointing out that the factors influencing low attainment are beyond the control of individual schools, and it's impossible for the schools to overcome wider problems of poverty. And you can state Clifton and Cook 2012 if you want to for that. Quoting Ofsted is enough. So something else we can bring into this argument is other conflicting perspectives from the government and the general kind of narrative around education policy. So one of the things that we see here is this is Christine Blower, who was actually the General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, which is now the NEU, the National Education Union. And this is talking about Ed Miliband actually being a product of meritocracy. So he made much of the excellent comprehensive education he received. And then she goes on to say, but the academies and the free schools programs will simply drive divisions in our society even further. And this needs to end. And this was at the time she was saying Labour needs to commit itself fully to levelling the playing field of a comprehensive education system, which is democratically accountable to the local community. So what Christine Blower is arguing, and what the unions are arguing here, is that actually this division that academies and free schools are creating in society is not just not making it better, but actually that it could create more division. And what I'd like you to do here is just pause this video for a moment and name 3 sociological concepts that you think, in this quote from Christine Blower about Ed Miliband, are actually shown. And as you can see, I've picked out here meritocracy, as mentioned before. So this idea that he made much of his excellent comprehensive education, furthering legitimising inequality. So the idea that education can legitimise inequality because of these academies and free schools. So where she's saying it drives divisions in society. And then this idea of a level playing field links very much with equality, but also compensatory education. So the idea that we do have policies which are there to level the playing field, and we call those compensatory policies. So moving on, the next thing to think about is really when we're evaluating education policy, we need to look at it from lots of different perspectives. The functionalist perspective, of course, is going to be the consensus theory. It's going to be more positive. And then you've got your Marxists and your feminists who are going to have a more negative view, a more conflict theory of society and therefore of the education system. But what we're interested in order to show the top mark band analysis and evaluation, are these sweet spots where there's actually an overlap, where these people, these groups agree on certain things. So we will have certain things that Marxists, functionalists and feminists all agree on, and we'll have things that Marxists and functionalists agree on and Marxists and feminists agree on a fair lot more. So there's this overlap, and this overlap allows us to say these people agree on this, but they disagree on this. And that comparison and that balance that you show in your essays is what starts to edge you towards those top mark bands. So what we are seeing is that functionalists, Marxists and feminists all agree that education serves to socialise and condition our values. Therefore, a lot of the policies are done with this in mind, that education is going to socialise and therefore have an impact on wider society. All 3 of these believe that societal structures, these are all structuralists, these theorists, structuralist perspectives. These structuralists believe that society has structures that have an effect on young people and therefore on the rest of society. They all believe that education policy could be used to create a level playing field, to change the outlook of young people and to challenge inequality and to challenge oppression. They believe different things, though, about how that might be done. They disagree, as you can see in the blue box here. They disagree on what the correct policies are. They disagree on whether we should support the deprived using government money. Because, of course, your functionalists, and if you look at the New Right, are worried about welfare dependency. They're worried about families not standing on their own 2 feet. Whereas, obviously, from a Marxist perspective, we're saying, well, hold on a minute, the bourgeoisie need to put some of this money back into society and we need to help the working class so they're not so oppressed and marginalised. And they also disagree on whether previous policies have been enough, good enough, effective enough, etc. So this is probably a good point to press pause. Okay, so hopefully you've paused or you're about to pause to take some notes on these slides. And remember, the focus here on this particular slide is identifying the common ground and where these three groups of structuralist theories, where they agree and then where they disagree, and how they would have conflicting views on the effectiveness of policies that have been brought in. The next question to ask yourself is, where are the key inequalities? Because if we can find the key inequalities, we can start to question whether or not the policies have been successful. So what would Marxists, because Marxists are most interested in inequality, and Marxists will highlight and illuminate the inequality in society, whereas functionalists tend to have more of a rose-tinted view of society, and they seem to just blame everything on the, family structure and socialization. So take a moment to just pause the video here and think about, what would Marxists focus on when they're looking at the education policies and the effectiveness and the inequalities in the system that could possibly be remedied or should have been remedied by education policy. And here are some suggested points that you might have made there. So Marxists would focus on the issues of material deprivation and how there are cycles of poverty, and it becomes a cycle of deprivation that's very hard to get out of. So that's essentially social reproduction. Criticisms, particularly Nell Keddy's very interested in this, criticisms of working class culture. So the idea that someone, a certain group of people's culture is considered not good enough, and then middle class culture is rewarded. And we could look to Bowles and Gintis. And we could also start to look at Bourdieu as well for this. Now, the myth of meritocracy. So Marxists would say, well, we've got this whole rhetoric from the government about how we're all equal and we just have to work hard enough. But Marxists will really take issue with this, and they do not believe that that is true. They believe that that's a way of legitimizing oppression and kind of blaming it on the people who are actually the victims of it. Marxists would also be interested in how we can share the wealth and level the playing field. So that would be, taking money from the bourgeoisie, usually that's through tax revenue, and then that money goes back in to level the playing field. And that would be looking at your policies like free school meals, EMA, pupil premium, even things like Sure Start centres. So putting the money back into the people who need it, rather than seeing this real disparity between people who are very wealthy and people who are marginalised. And then these notions of cultural capital. So the idea that it's not just about having money to be able to get into selective schools, universities, to do well at school, but it is about showing these kind of embodiment, this habitus, these activities and these attitudes and behaviours that you're expected to have that then get rewarded by teachers. And it's this middle class cultural capital. And actually that is quite oppressive. And if you look at theorists such as Louise Archer, she will say, and Diane Ray as well, they will say that the idea of treating one type of capital, middle class capital, as excellent, and then marginalising working class capital is symbolic violence. So it is actually incredibly oppressive, and it is discriminatory. And that leads on to this idea of ideological conditioning. So we can look at Althusser here. We could also still look at Pierre Bourdieu. And the idea that we are kind of, in the education system, we are conditioning everyone towards this capitalist meritocratic idea. And therefore it brings in this rhetoric of victim blaming. Perhaps you should have worked harder. Look at Alan Sugar. He came from nothing and he's been really successful. Everyone has that opportunity. Look at Margaret Thatcher. She was the daughter of a greengrocer, and then she managed to study chemistry and go to Oxford, and become Prime Minister. So we all have this equal chance of our equivalent of the American dream. So Marxists would be very critical. They would problematize a lot of the current New Right government rhetoric. They would problematize a lot of the New Right and the coalition policies. They would problematize the New Labour policies and the whole notion of marketisation.